Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Natalie Camacho Mendoza, and I am the board chair for Farmworker Justice. I'm honored to be your host for today's panel, Winning a Pathway to Citizenship for America's Undocumented Farm Workers and Why It's So Difficult. Today, we will explore solutions with some of the top experts. On behalf of Farmworker Justice Board of Directors and the National Advisory Council, and of course myself, we bid you a warm welcome for this incredibly important discussion on farm workers and immigration reform. I'm joined today by three respected and esteemed speakers. Each of our speakers plays an important national role in seeking immigration status and citizenship for undocumented immigrants, including farm workers and their families. They will discuss the obstacles that have prevented immigration reform legislation, current state of immigration reform that would affect farm workers, and the potential for congressional action this year. I thank our guest speakers for their participation and their commitment to justice for farm workers. Now I'd like to introduce Bruce Goldstein, the president of Farmworker Justice, to introduce today's topic. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Natalie. We all appreciate your contributions to our ongoing fight for the fair treatment of farm workers in this country. And welcome to our guests. We very much appreciate your participation. Today, we are asking the question, why is it so difficult to pass immigration reform that would grant undocumented farm workers and their family members a path to citizenship? We intend to answer that question, but more importantly, we intend to ask ourselves, what do we need to do to win such legislation? To help us answer these questions, I'll provide some background. Since it began in 1981, Farmworker Justice has played a leading role in immigration policy debates regarding farm workers. All through that time, there has been a consistent pattern. At the request of agricultural employers, members of Congress from both parties have repeatedly introduced legislation that would have converted most farm workers into a system of exploited guest workers on temporary work visas who would not have a path to immigration status and could be paid low wages with limited government oversight. Farm worker advocates and allies fought these proposals, but we could not win exactly what we wanted. In 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed. It included a compromise regarding agriculture. 1.1 million undocumented immigrant farm workers gained legal immigration status. And negotiated changes were made in the agricultural guest worker program. In the 1990s, members of Congress, at the request of agribusiness, introduced numerous bills to make major changes to the H-2A agricultural guest worker program that would have been devastating to farm workers. Farm worker advocates and allies stopped those bills from getting passed. As the number of undocumented farm workers increased, farm worker advocates wanted new legislation that would grant undocumented farm workers immigration status and a path to citizenship. But just as the growers could not get their wish list passed by Congress, farm worker advocates could not get their wish list passed either. That stalemate in Congress set up the conditions for serious negotiations on compromise legislation. During the past 15 years, there have been several bills introduced in Congress that were the product of compromises negotiated by bipartisan groups in Congress and representatives of agricultural employers and representatives of farm workers led by the United Farm Workers Union. The acronym for some of these bills was AgJobs. These AgJobs bills generally contained two components. One component was an earned legalization program for undocumented farm workers and their family members, leading to immigration status and citizenship. Under those programs, farm workers would have to show that they'd been working in U.S. agriculture, and then to earn a green card would be required to continue to work for some time in agriculture, although they could work in other occupations too. The second component was a set of changes to the H-2A agricultural guest worker program. Keep in mind that agricultural employers have significant political power among Republicans and Democrats, and they lobby hard for their priorities. The bill's provisions were carefully and painfully negotiated forcing concessions from each side. These bipartisan labor management compromises have not passed Congress, despite bipartisan support. That brings us to today. In my view, the main reason these compromise bills have not passed is the fierce opposition by conservative immigration restrictionists in Congress who do not want to grant foreign citizens, including people of color from other countries, the opportunity for immigration status and citizenship. Yet public opinion polls show that Americans support granting immigration status to undocumented immigrants, including farm workers, by wide margins. We must find a way to have Congress respond to the legitimate needs of farm worker families and the opinions of the American public. Farmworker Justice is committed to helping the farm worker movement win immigration reform. I look forward to hearing our guests' views on why it is so difficult to win immigration reform for farm workers and other undocumented immigrants, and how we can overcome the obstacles and bring a greater measure of justice to farm worker communities.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for presenting such an important commentary. And I also want to thank you for all the work that you do for Farmworker Justice. You have helped Farmworker Justice achieve many of its goals, but we continue to need to make additional strides for the rights of farm workers in this country. And this event today is a demonstration of the commitment we have for Farmworker Justice and for farm workers in America. For today's discussion, we have invited Congresswoman Judy Chu to share some remarks regarding the progress towards citizenship for farm workers in America. Congresswoman Judy Chu is the U.S. Representative for California's 27th Congressional District and has been in Congress since 2009. Congresswoman Chu is a member of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee and its subcommittees on health, giving her oversight over healthcare reform and crucial safety net programs, oversight and workers and family support. She's also a member of the House Budget and House Small Business Committees. Farmworker Justice has recognized Representative Chu with an award for her work on occupational safety advocacy, particularly heat stress prevention legislation, as well as immigration reform and other vital issues facing farm workers.
Hello, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu, and I'm so thrilled to be taking part in today's event to bring awareness to the challenges faced by undocumented farm workers and their families and the need for immigration reform. I want to thank Farmworker Justice for hosting today's conversation, and I want to thank all of you for fighting for immigration reform that empowers farm workers and supports those who work so hard for the sake of our economy. Farm workers and their families are the backbone of the agricultural economy in our country and will play a key role in our nation's recovery from the dual economic and health crises we've all experienced over this past year. But this is also an incredibly vulnerable group, with approximately 50% of the workforce being undocumented. That means there are hundreds of thousands of essential workers we depend on to provide the food for our tables who live in fear they could be deported at any moment. This is wrong, and we must ensure that these individuals critical to our American infrastructure are able to come out of the shadows, earn a fair wage, and be protected from exploitation from a country that's been their home for years. That is why, just this March, I was so proud to cast my vote to put millions of aspiring Americans onto the path to citizenship when the House voted to pass the Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. These bills recognize that millions of hardworking immigrants who are American in every way deserve the chance to be citizens. But we must do more because they know that so many of their workers are undocumented. Some unscrupulous employers use that as an excuse to deny them basic rights, working them to the point of physical harm or even death. That's why I'm so proud that President Biden's signature immigration reform bill, the U.S. Citizenship Act, also includes my bill, the Protect Our Workers Against Exploitation and Retaliation, or POWER Act, to ensure that workers who suffer labor violations and or report unfair labor practices are eligible for a U visa so they are not deported or retaliated against while their claims are investigated. I also recently reintroduced the Asunción Valdivia Heat, Illness, and Fatality Prevention Act. Asunción Valdivia was a farm worker who died a preventable death due to picking grapes with no protections in 105-degree temperatures. It led me to push California to have the first standards for heat protections for outdoor workers. Now, with this bill, we can have a federal standard to protect all workers by directing OSHA to adopt a final standard to protect both indoor and outdoor workers against excessive heat. We need members on both sides of the aisle to recognize that immigration is not only an economic issue, but also a moral one. And that is why your involvement today is so important. By speaking out, we can affirm that we are a nation of immigrants and that anybody can achieve the American dream if they're willing to work for it. That's the lesson that's inspired generations of immigrants to build this country, and that is the lesson we cannot afford to forget. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Chu, for your enlightened comments. We will now hear from United States Senator Alex Padilla of California about his efforts towards winning a pathway to citizenship for America's undocumented farm workers and other essential immigrant workers. Senator Padilla was sworn in as California's first Latino Secretary of State on January 5th, 2015. Then, in December 2020, Alex was appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom to finish the term of Vice President Kamala Harris. Senator Padilla serves as chairman of the Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, and Border Safety. He also serves as a member of the Senate Committee on Budget, Environment and Public Works, Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, Judiciary, and Rules. Senator Padilla held a hearing in the Immigration Subcommittee on May 12th on the contributions of immigrant essential workers, and our very own Bruce Goldstein testified about farm workers and immigration reform. We welcome Senator Padilla to share his remarks.
Hi, I'm Senator Alex Padilla. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. I have the honor of representing California in the United States Senate, and I'm proud to be the first Latino to do so. As a proud son of immigrants from Mexico, the subject of immigration reform is personal to me. My parents arrived in the United States from different regions of Mexico with little formal education, but a tremendous work ethic and big dreams. They met in Los Angeles, they fell in love, decided to get married, and applied for green cards in that order. And I know firsthand the value that immigrants bring to this country. I'm here because of my parents' many years of hard work and the values that they instilled in my sister, my brother, and me. The importance of getting a good education and seeking out opportunities to serve others. But I'm also here because of my parents' good fortune. Today, too many immigrants across the country with the same values and drive to succeed as my mom and dad are left to struggle against the arbitrary and unfair rules of our immigration system. Now, no state has more at stake in immigration reform than my home state of California. We're the agricultural heart of the nation, growing more than 1/3 of the country's vegetables and 2/3 of the country's fruits and nuts. And for decades, our agricultural industry has relied on the labor of immigrants. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the critical importance of farm workers. During the pandemic, farm workers were classified by the federal government as essential workers. Despite the dual dangers of the pandemic and a record-breaking fire season, farm workers continued to show up for work. Farm workers laboring on the front lines risk their own health and the health of their families to keep groceries on our nation's shelves. And because so many were on the front lines, immigrant farm workers and their families suffered a disproportionate number of illnesses and deaths. At the same time, many of these brave workers faced increased risks because of their undocumented status. Too many were denied necessary personal protective equipment, for example, and others were unable to seek out health care. Too many were simply afraid to speak out about dangerous working conditions because they faced a fear of retaliation. More than 500,000 farm workers contracted COVID. Thousands died. Farm workers and all of those who served in frontline jobs during the pandemic deserve better. They deserve respect, security, and a pathway to citizenship. And that's why I introduced the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act as my very first bill in the United States Senate. And we discussed the essential work of undocumented immigrants at the first meeting of the Senate Subcommittee on Immigration, which I'm honored to chair. And it was a privilege to hear Bruce Goldstein's testimony on the contributions of farm workers and the challenges that farm workers face. Immigrants' work has always been essential, and it's past time for Congress to recognize that fact and act accordingly. Passing immigration reform that respects immigrants' dignity and worth will strengthen our economy and communities for all. Thank you all so very much for your advocacy, and please continue to stay safe.
We appreciate Senator Padilla's comments and his support for farm workers. Now, I would like to introduce our distinguished guests for today's discussion, Winning a Pathway to Citizenship for America's Undocumented Farm Workers and Why It's So Difficult. I would like to introduce Tom Saenz, President and General Counsel of MALDEF, the Mexican American and Legal Defense and Education Fund. Thomas is a leader and a national expert on Latino civil rights, education, employment, immigration, voting rights, redistricting, and public resource equity. Thomas leads the civil rights organization's 5 offices in pursuing litigation, policy advocacy, and community education to promote civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. Tom and Bruce collaborate as board members of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, or NHLA, a coalition of the most prominent Latino policy organizations. Next, we have Teresa Romero, President of United Farmworkers, the nation's oldest and largest farmworker labor union. The UFW has collective bargaining agreements and offices in several states, in addition to its headquarters in California. California is home to the largest number of farmworkers in the nation, as it has granted farmworkers more of the same labor rights as other workers, and due in part largely to the advocacy of the UFW. Farmworker Justice has been privileged to collaborate with UFW for many years. Teresa Romero is also the first Latina and first immigrant woman to become president of a national union in the United States. And we are joined again by Bruce Goldstein, President of Farmworker Justice. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for participating. The panel.
Thank you.
Great. The panelists in today's discussion all have great insights into the long-term fight for justice for immigrants and farm workers, and particularly we look to gain, and particularly for farm workers, we look to gain better understanding of the struggle and prospects for immigration reform. And today's format isn't a question and answer session, so I'm going to get started. My first question is for Tom, and it goes to the heart of our topic today. Tom, you've had a decade of experience in, or decades of experience in the struggle to win legislation that would grant undocumented immigrants, including farm workers and their family members, the opportunity for immigration status and citizenship. What and who are the obstacles to winning legislation granting immigration status and citizenship for undocumented people?
I think the biggest obstacle is one that Bruce alluded to earlier, and that is the increased partisanization of this issue. In the past, we've had bipartisan majorities, bipartisan leadership on every effort toward reforming our immigration laws to better respect civil and human rights. But in the last decade or so, we've seen this issue become heavily partisanized, where the Republican Party has almost to a person aligned itself with those who would oppose providing rights to the many, many folks in agriculture and elsewhere who have contributed to the growth of our economy, raised families, and contributed to the advancement of our society. That partisanization has become even more pronounced as the Republican Party has basically acceded leadership to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has built his political career and ran his entire administration through a lens of opposition to immigrants and to Latino immigrants in particular. And this partisanization has led to Republicans basically abandoning what would have traditionally been viewed as pillars of their ideology. That includes the centrality of family. We should make no mistake, but the failure to enact this legislation is anti-family, and their support for national security. We know throughout our nation's history that agriculture, perhaps ahead of any other industry, is an industry tied to national security. From the earliest times, we know that a nation that cannot feed itself is going to have difficulty defending itself. So agriculture tied to national security, it ought to be a central concern for Republicans, given their traditional philosophy, to enact legislation that would recognize the contributions of immigrant farm workers. But we have seen this partisanization and, in my mind, a perversion of the debate around these issues. And that stands today as the greatest obstacle.
Thank you. Teresa, I have the same question for you from your perspective and as the leader of the United Farmworkers Union. What and who are the obstacles to winning legislation granting immigration status and citizenship for undocumented people?
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me in this important forum. When it comes to farm workers, it is not difficult for farm workers to do the hard work that needs to be done to win legalization. In spite of their challenges that they face, they have carved time out, have agreed to tough concessions, and even sacrificed paydays to go to Washington, D.C. and meet with members of Congress so they can hear directly from them why immigration reform is important. So if I am asked why is it difficult to win legalization, to me, those who need to answer that question are those who are not using their power, access, and privilege to ensure that Republican senators know that we spend months in tough negotiations, that we reach significant compromise, and instead they're spending their time trying to figure out how to get an even better deal at the expense of farm workers. So farm workers have done the hard work that needs to be done, have taken action. I think it is time right now for the Senate to do the same thing, do the hard work that needs to be done and take action. Farm workers are the backbone of agriculture. And like Tom just said, they can't be left out and they cannot be treated as second-class citizens.
MALDEF works so hard to achieve immigration reform legislation that would grant undocumented immigrants a pathway to citizenship. And how would that change people's lives and affect our nation?
Well, I think this is an essential step to secure the future thriving of our nation. We cannot continue to have so many millions of people who have basically dedicated their lives to this country by living here over many years, by contributing through their labors, through their intellect, through their participation in civic betterment, who have raised families here, who have raised children with an expectation that those children will have every opportunity to achieve the American dream. We cannot continue to ignore the contributions of such a large component of our population and continue to thrive as a nation. Not only is it inconsistent with the rhetoric, very important constitutional and philosophical rhetoric and beliefs that are the foundation of our nation, even as our history indicates that we've been too often untrue to those important principles. But not only is the current situation inconsistent with those principles, but it creates a long-term danger that we will alienate some of the most important future contributors to our society as government leaders, as innovators, as business leaders, as intellectual leaders. The children that we are talking about, many of them United States citizen children born here, whose parents have not had the opportunity to regularize their status. But they are the future of this country, and we cannot continue to alienate such an important cohort and have any chance of continuing our great success as a nation.
Right. Teresa, I have the same question for you regarding the farmworker community. Why has the United Farmworkers Union placed such high priority on winning immigration reform, and how would a path to immigration status and citizenship affect farm workers and their communities?
You know, during last year, we've all known and suffered the results of a pandemic. Farm workers have been working in the fields, harvesting the food that we all consume day in and day out. Farm workers go to work, and their children at this point don't know, and they're afraid if the parents are going to come home from work. Many of these children, like Tom said, are U.S. citizens, and they're the future of country, and they're growing up in a world of fear. Farm workers cannot be considered essential and not being treated as such. They contribute to put food on our table sometimes when they can't even put food on their own tables. If we think about it during the pandemic, every time we would go to the store, we would find our fruits and vegetables and produce there. So their work is very important. We cannot continue to treat them as second-class citizens. As essential workers, they should be treated as essential people as they are. And they've been here for many years working in the fields, contributing to our economy for decades. And the right thing to do is for them to have a path to legalization, and live a normal life without fear, as you know, all of us here are.
Thank you. Tom, there are several bills pending on citizenship status for undocumented immigrants. What are the prospects for winning immigration reform with a path to citizenship this year? And with all the talk about filibusters and the reconciliation process, do you have thoughts on how the Senate should and is likely to act?
Well, it's quite clear, as you've heard from Teresa, it's imperative that we get folks doing the work to get this important legislation passed. And that is primarily the task of Senate leadership. And I mean leadership from both parties. Really need to step up and, in a democracy, reflect the views of supermajorities of people throughout the United States. Supermajorities of our population support legislation that would provide a pathway to citizenship for the workers and community members that we're talking about. So to reflect the views of everyone in this democracy would lead to enactment of this legislation. But we know that through measures like the filibuster, through measures like representation in the United States Senate, which skews towards smaller, less populated states, but we know that these two mechanisms provide too much weight to minority views meaning views not held by the majority of people. And in this case, it's a small minority of folks who oppose this legislation. When you go out and inform people and talk to them about their views, we are talking about a thin slice of America that opposes this legislation, but that is magnified because of things like the filibuster. I think it's quite clear that we need to look very carefully at whether the filibuster should continue to apply in circumstances where it can block legislation that is so essential to our future as a country, as we've described, and it has such huge levels of support throughout our country.
Teresa, the same question for you. There are several bills pending on immigration status for the undocumented. Do you believe we are close to immigration reform that would address the needs of undocumented farm workers and their families? And what are your thoughts about the Senate and their likelihood to act, given the potential filibuster?
You know, we have been working with Bruce on this, so he understands all the years that we have put into winning immigration reform for farm workers. If we have done polls talking to voters, and the big majority, as Tom just said, support these bills. The problem is that right now the Senate is, playing politics, and they want to use other issues with immigration and the border to try not to focus on the bills that they have right now on their desk, which is one of them is the Farm Workforce for Modernization Act. And the fact that they want to get distracted, it is the wrong thing to do. They know that without farm workers, like I said earlier, the agriculture industry will collapse. We have already negotiated and conceded on things that we would have not, likely seen done, but it is a compromise. And this is not the time to negotiate anymore. This is the time to act. This is the time to make sure that farm workers get legalization. And, let's not play politics. It is a good thing for the country. It is a good thing for farm workers, and it's a good thing for the agriculture industry.
For the final question, I want to ask each of you what all of us can do and should we do to help win the legislation that grants undocumented immigrants immigration status and a path to citizenship. What must all of us do to maximize the pressure on Congress so that it does pass immigration reform? Tom, I'm going to start with you.
It's not an easy question, but I think that there is a role for all of us, and that role has been played already by so many, including farm workers and others who are the ones who would gain a path to citizenship from this effort. But all the rest of us need to do a couple of things. First, inform yourself about these issues. Another obstacle that we face is a lack of knowledge throughout the country about how our immigration system works and the injustice that's involved in our current immigration system, resulting in so many millions of people suffering from not having the protections that they're entitled to given their contributions to our country. And that includes all of our farm workers. So inform yourself. Then make sure that your elected officials know that you are informed, understand these issues, and that you get and want them to get the urgency of change to our existing system. I think we need to see a groundswell telling those who are not representing the views of their constituents, because as we've said, super majorities of people in this country support this legislation. That means that those who are presenting obstacles to the legislation are not representing their constituents. So what we all can do is use every means, whether that's organizing in demonstrations or social media or traditional media, or even using every opportunity to speak to our neighbors and others about the fact that we are informed on the flaws in the existing system and the urgency of change.
Teresa, what can all of us do to help win the important struggle?
Obviously, I echo everything that Tom said, but right now time is of the essence. And I think once people are engaged and informed of what this bill does, pick up the phone, call your senators, let them know how important it is as their constituents. Hearing from their constituents is key for them to make a decision. They need to understand that the people who voted for them are supporting this bill. And the more calls that people can make and put pressure on the senators, the more they would understand how important, how many people are engaged in this and how important it is to them and how they support it.
Great. I want to thank you both for all that you do for immigrants and farm workers, and all the support you give and to so many people that are working and struggling so much in our fields to produce the food that we all rely on and we all eat. So thank you so much. Now I'd like to ask Bruce for some final thoughts on the question of what we can do and how Farmworker Justice is helping the farm worker movement achieve immigration reform. Bruce.
Well, thank you, Natalie, and thanks again for serving as our board chair and our moderator today. And thanks very much to Senator Padilla and Representative Chu, and special thanks to our guest, Teresa Romero, President of the United Farm Workers, and Tom Saenz, the President and General Counsel of MALDEF. They both have extraordinary knowledge and commitment, and we really appreciate them sharing that with us today. We owe it to farm workers to win this policy battle. Congress owes it to farm workers to pass immigration reform with a path to citizenship. The large majority of farm workers are immigrants. Most are undocumented. Why? Because our immigration system is broken. Farm workers work in one of the most dangerous and low-paid jobs in the nation. Most labor laws still discriminate against farm workers by denying them the same labor protections as other workers. Their rural communities often have limited infrastructure that limits access of farm workers and their children to health care, internet service, healthy food sources, and vaccines. Farm workers have suffered disproportionately from the COVID-19 pandemic. As essential workers, they have been expected to work in person in the fields. They could not telecommute. They are essential for our food system. We cannot eat safe, healthy food without them. Too often, they have not been given the safety protections or access to health care that they need. And the undocumented immigrants in agriculture have often suffered the most. Often they are too afraid of arrest and deportation and the splitting up of their families to challenge unfair or illegal conduct, or go to public places for services, or simply ask their employer for a mask. We must win immigration reform, and it must provide a reasonable path to immigration status and citizenship. And we must continue to fight for improvements in farm workers' working and living conditions. You and our audience can help us achieve victory by calling your senators and congressional representatives. Farmworker Justice depends on public support for the work that we do. We provide farm workers with our valuable services at no charge. We ask for your support through contributions to help us win this struggle for justice. You may donate at farmworkerjustice.org, where you will also find extensive information on immigration policy and other resources. I thank you very much for your attention, and I thank our guests.
Thank you. This has been an enlightening discussion about the challenges and opportunities for passing legislation, granting undocumented immigrants the opportunity for immigration status and citizenship. And again, I'm so grateful for our guests for this discussion. As viewers, I urge you to continue to follow the immigration policy debate and tell your senators and representatives that you want them to pass legislation granting immigration status and citizenship to undocumented immigrants, including the nation's farm workers and their families. Your actions do make a difference. If you enjoyed today's program, please join Farmworker Justice in our efforts to secure fundamental human rights and civil rights for 2.5 million farm workers who harvest the fruits and vegetables you rely on every day. So consider making a donation. Farmworker Justice does not charge farm workers or their organizations for its services, so we do depend on people like you to enable us to carry out our assistance to the farm worker communities. So again, you can visit farmworkerjustice.org to donate and learn more about the work we are doing to empower farm workers. Our website has extensive information, as Bruce indicated, and you can find fact sheets on pending legislation. So this will conclude our program for today, and I thank you so much for joining us.